the liberal world was created with the rise of individualism in the 17th and 18th century, and it may well be the case that individuals are being deconstructed as we speak. We may be moving to a post-liberal world because of the nature of the technology that these people have created. So I would say that the liberal order faces two massive threats at the moment. One is the axis of autocracy. The secondly is the tech industry. And I would say of the two, the tech industry is the bigger threat.
Before we start today's episode of Downstream, I just have a request from you guys watching, listening. We are obviously tremendously ambitious here at Novara Media in terms of building a new media for different politics. We've been doing it for a really long time, about 15 years actually. We're getting somewhere though. In March 2026, we broke our record for the most views in 1 month on YouTube, about 32 million views, more apparently than Ben Shapiro, which is of course amusing, but it's just the start. We have 1 million plus subscribers on YouTube, 1.2 million to be precise. We're getting there on Instagram too. Across all social platforms, we have about, I think, 3.5 million people following us. We are helping to build a new media for different politics. We are so ambitious for the rest of this decade, and we are making a difference. We're going to make a huge leap in 2026. More about that maybe in a few weeks, a few months' time. But we need to hear from you guys in order to execute that as effectively as possible. To do that, we're having an audience survey. Don't worry, there is a big upside for you besides helping your favorite media organization. You could win by participating in that survey. One of 5 £50 vouchers to spend at the Novara merch shop. You can buy books, t-shirts, tote bags. The deadline for that is on Sunday, April 12th. It is very important for us. It's really helpful for us. And who knows, you might be 50 quid better off in the process. So if that sounds good to you, go to novara.media/survey. It's in the description below. We live in a moment of crisis. Cliche, I know, it's true. Ecological crisis, climate change, automation, AI, inequality, shifting geopolitics. What the hell is going on in Iran right now? But maybe the biggest crisis of all is the crisis of liberalism, the prevailing set of ideas ruling the economy and society for my entire lifetime, basically, and its inability to come up with solutions to all the challenges that basically everyone agrees on. That crisis of liberalism fundamentally means that we can't actually step beyond the problems. We can't be propositional about where we go next. And the last people to admit the crisis of liberalism, it turns out, are generally liberals. They're never to blame for anything. They'll point at the left and say, why won't you apologize to the Cultural Revolution and Chairman Mao? But they're unable to talk about the defects of their own ideology hundreds of years ago or even this year. And that's a problem. Somebody is trying to change that, though. They're not all that way. Adrian Wooldridge worked at the Economist magazine for over 30 years. He's written a new book, Centrists, the World Unite, The Lost Genius of Liberalism. And despite the title, don't hold it against him, it's one of the best critiques I've actually seen of modern liberalism. I agree with some of the stuff in here and I disagree on stuff elsewhere, but I'm kind of surprised. If we're going to solve the problems that basically everyone agrees on in the 21st century, we have to start with acknowledging where we've gone wrong. And liberals, you're front of the queue. Adrian Wooldridge, it's a pleasure to have you on Downstream.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Very happy to have you here. You came in, you're probably unsure of the reception you might get, ideologically frosty perhaps, but I have to say I really enjoyed the book. You are the author of Centrists of the World Unite, The Lost Genius of Liberalism. It's pretty long, but not too long. It's about, 300 pages. And I suppose briefly, to start from the top, it's composed of 3 parts, as I understand it. It's only really the first part, that history of liberalism, where I kind of strongly disagree with you. We'll get to all of that. Let's start from the top. What is liberalism and what are its defining characteristics?
Well, it's a very, very difficult word to define. It has slightly different connotations in different countries. But I would say there are 2 sorts of views of what liberalism is. One is the conservative view, which would say that liberalism really means free markets and a restricted state. And the neoconservatives would say that's what the essence of liberalism is. There's the left-wing view that liberalism means being compassionate and nice to people. That's left-wing liberalism. And I think both of those are possible manifestations of liberalism, but they're not the essence of liberalism. The essence of liberalism is that society consists of individuals rather than of collectivities, that we should have a regime of tolerance whereby diversity of opinion is institutionalized and accepted, and the constraints on power, the divisions of power. I would say those are the fundamental characteristics of liberalism. Whether you have a big state or a small state, whether you have a regime of being nice to people or not, are secondary things. Keynes was a liberal. He believed in having a bigger interventionist state. Hayek was a liberal. He believed in having a smaller market-dominated state. I think those are secondary characteristics. You can be a liberal believing in a big state. You can't be a liberal believing that you should have a state religion imposed on people on penalty of death.
And when does it start? What's the genesis of liberalism?
Liberalism, for most of human history, society has been pretty stagnant or pretty static. It's grown very slowly, so it would grow at about 10% a century, very, very slowly, imperceptible growth. And society has imposed collective beliefs on people as a condition of membership. That's the basic human condition. And what happened in about the middle of the 18th century was that society begins to be more mobile, that the economy begins to grow, that trade begins to increase, and growth becomes something that's structural, that's inherent in society. And people also begin to assert their rights or their individual demands, and they begin to say, well, we shouldn't accept beliefs simply because the state says that we should accept beliefs. So liberalism comes along and says society should start with the individual rather than the collective. It should start with a notion of people choosing their beliefs, not having to do what the government, not having to believe what the government tells them, and that mobility should be a sort of condition of the economy. So you have the great beginnings of liberalism. Let's say you come with Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, 1776. You have the American Declaration of Independence, 1776. You have legislation that makes publishing free of censorship or restriction, which also happens, strangely enough, in Sweden in exactly the same year, 1776. So it's the idea of society not being top-down, dictated to by religious groups or economic groups, but much more self-selected. It's obviously much more complicated and slow than that, but those are the fundamental things that create the liberal dynamic.
I mean, I presume you would accept there are elements that precede all of that which are in keeping with that. So, for instance, there are parts of the book where you talk about liberalism as a rebellion against the feudal order. So totally. Immutability of the feudal order, things can't change. Authority is natural, whether it's ecclesiastical or political, those two things are synthesized to some extent. But obviously you get things like the Peasants' War in Germany in the 1300s, you get the Levellers in the English Civil War. Would you describe, for instance, those movements as having ideas, values, impulses which are antecedent to liberalism? Or are we talking about a different sort of historical tradition which, in some ways overlaps with liberalism?
No, absolutely they're part of it. I don't know enough about the German case, but let's talk about the English Civil War. What you see in the English Civil War is a breakdown of systems of censorship. So you do have a proliferation of different beliefs. You have people like John Milton, the classic example of that, saying that people should be allowed to say what they want because the only way that truth is reached is by open discussion. And you have groups like the Levellers saying, when Adam's wove and Eve span, who is then the gentleman? That society should not be something that's positions should not be dictated by birth. So yes, you do have strong antecedents there. And then you get, to move to a more complicated thing or a less emotive thing, which is the division of powers. I think one of the central things about liberalism is that you don't have you reject the notion that power should be unconstrained, and you have all sorts of limits imposed upon power. Through the Constitution, through inalienable rights and all of the rest of that sort of thing. Again, after the English Revolution, you get the reassertion of monarchic power, but it is monarchic power that is constrained in certain ways, certainly after the 1688 revolution. So yes, all of the elements of liberalism are already there. And why I focus in the book really on the middle of the 18th century is because it becomes irreversible. All of these things, are no longer pushed back completely. And you do have mobility as the absolute condition of life in the way that it wasn't in the 17th century, and certainly wasn't during the Peasants' Revolt in the 13th century.
So we've got that there. We've got the English Civil War there. Somebody who's in a similar sort of neck of the woods moment in time is, of course, Thomas Hobbes. Now,
yes,
people will be watching this, and they did their political philosophy undergraduate degree, and they'll have learned that, social contract is the bedrock of the liberal worldview, individualist methodology. John Locke being there makes sense, but then you have very smart people who say, actually, so is Thomas Hobbes, even though he sounds a very authoritarian thinker. So walk me through this, because most people, and I'm sure for some of our audience this is quite boring, but this is really important to the arguments that you're going to make. Most people view liberalism as an order where people can broadly do what they like with some constraints. But Thomas Hobbes, for the modern mind, is basically proposing something which looks like tyranny.
Yeah.
An all-powerful sovereign who can basically, and he talks about this quite overtly, can just kill who he likes and do what he likes. He's talking, of course, about the actual body politic and the state, but we use the he as a broader term, the sovereign. So how is that liberal, and where does that fit into the history of liberalism?
I mean, I talk about three figures as being the origins of liberalism. One of them is Erasmus, one of them is Montesquieu, and one of them is Hobbes. Hobbes is the most complicated and difficult of those three because he is a sort of very illiberal liberal, or he's a totalitarian liberal, because he basically, what he says, which is liberal, which is why he's so fundamental to the rise of the liberal order, is that he says that society consists of atomized individuals. This is where you must start if you're trying to understand society, with those individuals. He then goes on to argue that those individuals, in order to stop themselves from killing each other, will form a social contract whereby they hand over all their power to the sovereign. They're making a contract. So they are doing what they do in order to maximize their chances of survival. So the ultimate justification of having a sovereign is it advances the interests of the individuals who compose society. And that's actually an extremely radical move, because up until then, people who defended the established order of things defended on the basis of the divine right of kings or the divine will of God, or on the basis of tradition. They quite often talked about the family, the patriarch of the family being the person who naturally dominates the family. Hobbes throws all of that away. He also throws away the sort of classical tradition of saying that there's a telos, that society must move towards the good, and in order to move towards the good, it has to do various things. He says, no, there's none of that. There's just individuals who hate each other, and in order to stop themselves from killing each other, impose this set of constraints on themselves. Now, is that a totalitarian view of things? And we might talk more about this in relation to China afterwards, which I think is extremely interesting. But to some extent it is, but he doesn't believe in limited power, but he believes that the state doesn't need to bother itself with things that aren't stopping people from killing each other. So these individuals, once they've given all their power to the state, can have quite a lot of freedom to engage in commerce and to look after their lives, as long as they're not killing each other or subverting the order. So there's a lot of freedom sort of given to those individuals. So the justification is individuals living rather than dying and then pursuing their own interests. It's not a totalitarian vision, and it says that all individuals must do the same thing or believe the same thing. They must just resist the temptation to kill each other.
But there's also in Hobbes this idea that you need to ward against the idea of virtue. And this is a really powerful...
Very much so.
And I think for the left, it's very concerning, right? Because we view political action as an affirmative, positive thing. Yes. And what Hobbes says is that actually the supreme value of any successful society is peaceability. I mean, this is in Leviathan.
Yep.
Peaceability and not virtue. Whereas somebody like Rousseau or Machiavelli would say, no, it's active, publicly minded virtue. Hobbes is saying the complete opposite. And so for somebody on the left, they would say, well, you're saying that the state is there to just, guarantee that people don't kill each other, but it's also premised on fundamentally a a form of political nullity. I think that Leo Strauss makes this exact point, that effectively that is the birth of the idea that the state is there to guarantee market transactions and little beyond that. What is that a correct interpretation of Hobbes?
That's absolutely right. And there's a Marxist scholar called C.B. Macpherson who says exactly the same thing, and that this is the origins of individualism. And it's, you leave the public sphere to people pursuing their own market interests. You make sure that they don't kill each other, and that's all that society is about. And you talk about the Marxist or the left-wing view. So he doesn't break with that because it doesn't exist at the time, but he's not interested in that. But what he's breaking with is the classical tradition that says that the telos of man is to do good in the world in some way. And he's treated at the time as a very dangerous and subversive figure, although he's the tutor to Cavendish, he's the tutor to Charles II for a while. Nevertheless, a lot of conservatives, or a lot of traditionalists at the time regard him as a very subversive figure, and his view of the world is a very cold view of the world. I think it's amazing, it's a brilliant, it's a remarkable book, but it is an extraordinarily, it voids a lot of what human life is about from that. And one of the interesting ramifications of this, the Benthamites take up this notion of society consisting purely of atomized individuals. But also I think you can see quite a lot of this sort of thinking in China as well, whereby basically the state is there to stop bad things from happening, to stop authority from being challenged, and it's very, very assertive about those sorts of things. But quite often it's sort of, as long as people are not challenging the government and not entering the political sphere, you can do quite a lot that's allowed. Make money. So
people who are, that's what I think Leo Strauss says, right? That there's an exchange of the idea of public virtue for embourgeoisification, or as Deng said, it's glorious to get rich.
Yes, absolutely.
So people might be watching, listening, and think, what the hell has this got to do with, contemporary politics? And I think it brings us back to an important point you make in the book, page 152. Just to prove I've read it, which of course I have. I read all the books on this show. You say that liberalism's dark shadow is populism. Mm-hmm. And the sort of the generic and I think correct take from much of the left is that liberalism's dark shadow is fascism, right? And it goes back to the idea that, yes, liberalism is an ideology or a philosophy of the private sphere, of free trade, of free speech, of individual autonomy, all those things. At the same time, it's also a creed of private property ownership. Mm-hmm. And, many people have made this observation that there is a tension between a democratic society and a society which has a fundamentalist belief with regards to private property ownership. Chantal Mouffe in The Democratic Paradox talks about you have on the one hand the idea that people are sovereign, and if a majority wants to change something, they can. On the other hand, private property rights are the sort of the utmost primacy in liberal society. So there's a tension there. Mm-hmm. And what fascism does when that tension becomes too strong in liberal societies like Italy in 1920 is that it takes a side with private property over democratic impulses or individual rights. And this might all sound quite abstract as a critique of liberalism, but look at Italy in 1920. You have people like Einaudi, an economist who later becomes president of the Italian Republic, on the side of Mussolini. You have at that time, I believe, the governor of the Bank of England saying that Mussolini was, necessary. Churchill saying, if I was Italian, I would probably support Mussolini. You have a large number of the Italian liberal intelligentsia in an economic crisis where private property relations are up for grabs because there's a radicalization of lots of the Italian working class. Factories are being shut across whole of 1919, 1920. Even as late, I think, as 21, Mussolini runs under an electoral bloc, which is led by Giovanni Giolitti, who was, of course, the great liberal statesman of Italy. How do you respond to that claim that in a crisis, the radical liberal who thinks that private property and private commerce is the be-all and end-all of political life, in a crisis, historically, we just see many of those people siding with the likes of Mussolini, to a lesser extent Adolf Hitler. But Mussolini is the paradigmatic example.
And Mussolini is a very, very articulate opponent of liberalism, actually. And he says that liberalism is a terrible thing. and that what we must do is engage in noble, great experiments. He regards, as Nietzsche regarded, liberalism as being a petty sort of thing, and it reduces man to a series of transactions. We must have a more exciting world. So let me sort of push back against what you're saying. I think that what happens in a world in which the centre collapses, the economy stagnates, people begin to panic, is that it's certainly the case that people with property are more likely to jump to the right than they are to the left. And if the right is a fascist right, they may be willing to accept that as the price of maintaining their property. But I also would say that throughout its history, starting with the French Revolution, a lot of liberalism has been deliberately centrist and deliberately couched in terms of the defense of moderation. So the first centrists are people who sit in the centre of the parliament. People on the right, the traditionalists, the monarchists, are sitting physically on the right of the parliament. People on the left, the people who support the French Revolution becoming bloodier, sit on the far left. The centrists sit in the middle. Why are they centrists? They're centrists out of a sense that they don't believe in very fixed ideological solutions to things. They're centrists also in the sense that they have a certain temperament, a centrist temperament. They believe that politics should be under control, that you should have a rational solution to a set of problems. So you've presented the image of panicked liberals jumping to the right because they're terrified of their property. But I would say that the liberal tradition has always been about not going too far to the right, not going too far to the left, for both temperamental and ideological reasons, and defending the centre against assault. Now, how do you defend the centre against assault? What liberals have tended to do is to change the mix between the state and the market in order to ensure that people aren't too unhappy, and that they don't think of the world as a choice between communism on the one hand and fascism on the other hand. So what you get towards the end of the 19th century, let's say in the 1890s, is the Liberal Party is sitting there. It's full of people who have done very well out of life. They're sitting in the Reform Club, they're drinking their port, they've got their OBEs and the rest of it, and who have a very fixed ideology. And that ideology is that the state shouldn't intervene very much. The state should be basically a ring holder. It should be it should be a fairly passive instrument. These people are very they're status quo, but it's a decadent liberalism. Then you get a bunch of new liberals coming along and saying, actually, if we continue to do this and behave in this way, trade unionists will be alienated. The labour movement will be alienated. Workers will jump to the left. They also say that we're wasting a lot of talent in terms of children who aren't being properly educated. We've got sewerage in the street. We've got all of that sort of thing. So in order to ensure that the liberal order survives, we have to change the mix between the state and the market. They do exactly that. And you get something called new liberalism, which comes along. And what new liberalism does is to say that in order to give individuals, make individuals make the best of themselves, you have to have state intervention in various ways, health, education, and things like that. And very rapidly, after 1900, this dead, ossified philosophy becomes a dynamic philosophy. Very rapidly, you get a number of people of great talent joining the Liberal Party, Lloyd George, Asquith, but also Churchill comes from the Conservatives and joins the Liberal Party. And you get some legislation passed which lays the foundations of the welfare state, free school milk, free school education, all of that sort of thing. And the reason I'm going to emphasise Churchill a bit, I won't go on forever, but I'll talk about Churchill. So what you get in England, and also a parallel development of the United States, is the centre being saved by people who want to save property, of course they do, but they also want to save a certain way of life in an age of mass mobilisation in which they think that those values may be destroyed. Britain saves those things. by taking on the elites as well as expanding the role of the state. America does the same thing. Italy doesn't do that. Germany doesn't do that. And the centre collapses in those countries. So when Churchill says friendly things about Mussolini, as he does, I think that's more about the problem of the rise of Hitler and balancing various instruments and the idea of trying to pull Mussolini away from Germany, because at that time that was a possible sort of thing. But Churchill is a very interesting figure in that he is very willing to reform the system in order to save the system from from the centre.
So I want to be clear. I don't think that liberalism is some necessarily evil ideology. I think, and I think that's a misreading by many people on the left. If you look at, for instance, John Bright, William Cobden in the 19th century, these are the people who had the strongest critique of imperialism, for instance. And while the left is obviously very prone to talk about the role, quite rightly, of collective action, trade unions, the reformist movement, the Chartists, etc., to drive social economic change over the course of the mid-19th century onwards, true. There's clearly a role as well for patrician reformists, Shaftesbury, etc., who are changing things from both at the same time. And I think it's unfair to say this is all coming from one direction entirely. But I suppose to bring it back to this idea that left claim that the dark shadow of liberalism is fascism, and I think you're right. I think your reading is entirely correct, by the way. When the centre collapses, wealthier people are just more likely to go to the right to protect property. That didn't happen in Britain and America for quite contingent historical reasons. It did in Germany and Italy for the same sort of set of dynamics. I think that's very reasonable. But then let's rewind a few more centuries to sort of revisit that argument about fascism and liberalism. You have, I think, Samuel Johnson, who says the yelps of liberty from the Yankee are loudest when they are, whipping the Negro, something to that effect. So even though these people are talking about a republic founded on liberty and independence, it's actually about the liberty and freedom to own slaves. That's fundamentally what their cause is. And I think there's a great deal of truth to that. Montesquieu says something similar as well. He says, it is strange how slavery in Europe receded over centuries, but in our own time it's coming back. Montesquieu makes this observation, a great liberal. And I suppose, again, it's a challenge to liberals and liberalism. And like I said, it's only that first part of the book we talk about the history of liberalism. And we're not talking about contemporary things, but the history of liberalism and how this relates to the fascism point, that yes, liberalism is responsible for some of the extraordinary stuff you talked about, but it's absolutely unquestionable that the rise of, for instance, the Atlantic slave trade is led by the Dutch Republic, Britain, the United States. These are three liberal, not republics because Britain wasn't a republic, but three liberal states. Two of them are very much liberal constitutional republics. And that, to a sort of left-wing critic, isn't an accident. It's not an accident because private property plays such a central role in the liberal worldview to the extent you can even have people as private property, right? And that was the exact argument that John Locke makes, for instance, in the Constitution of the Carolinas. So rather than this being some dark shadow of liberalism, actually, it's core to the ideology. And of course, that's receded in the last 150 years. And of course, liberals played a very important role in getting rid of slavery, of course. But it does often feel like it's a major part of the historical tradition which liberals aren't willing to engage with. They'll say to people like me, quite rightly, how could you defend the Cultural Revolution? I don't. But the same point can be made about liberals who, aren't willing to challenge their own biases around somebody like Locke.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And let me give you an anecdote which reinforces your point, which was that during the Civil War, the Economist magazine actually had a choice of defending, of attacking. They had a choice of whether they were on the side of the North or the South. And initially, they said, well, actually, there are two things going on. There's the South, which is in favor of free trade, because free trade was basically, cotton was the essence of that, or the North, which is protectionist, which believes in tariffs. So the more important of these things is actually free trade. So for a while, not forever, they changed their mind, but for a while they were supporting the South because slavery was less important than trade. The question is let's get rid of the term fascism. Let's talk about imperialism and slavery. Whether these are core to liberalism, as certain people on the left would say, at least for a certain moment in history because of the prioritizing of property rights, or whether they are connected but not core, incidental. It's definitely the case that some liberals endorsed slavery because of property. Property rights were more important than everything else, of which the Economist was one example. It's also the case that there was a very, very important movement within liberalism, which is called liberal imperialism. And I have a chapter in the book about liberal imperialism because I think it's very important, and we'll talk about this later, but liberals own up to what they've done wrong and address the question of whether these things are core or peripheral. It's the case that liberals have defended bad things in the name of property in the past, and they've defended imperialism in the name of the cultural superiority of the West. I would say against that two things. One is that I don't think these things are core, that for every liberal imperialist, I could give you a liberal anti-imperialist. And a lot of liberals were anti-imperialists in the sense that they thought that distortions in trade were very bad. So the Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, is at its core actually a polemic against the East India Company because he thinks that's distorting and corrupting trade. There's always a group of liberals who are anti-imperialism and who are campaigning against imperialism. And for all that you've said that the Atlantic slave trade expands during the period of sort of commercial dominance of companies like the East India Company, there were always self-conscious liberals who were leading the campaign against it. The Clapham sect, people like Zachary Macaulay, devoted their lives, and his wife devoted their lives to the movement against slavery. And they did so not because just out of a moral revulsion, which they did feel, but also because they thought the essence of liberalism is the self-owning, self-determining individual, and that must apply to everybody, women, men, blacks, whites, everybody. So they would say that the core of liberalism led them to react against their own class and to demand the abolition of slavery, which eventually is abolished. On the question of empire, which is a very intriguing, very interesting question. Again, this notion of liberal imperialists is not just an arbitrary concatenation of terms. These people were imperialists because they were liberals. But they believed that they had a superior culture, a superior mode of life, and that gave them the right to run other parts of the world, primarily India. And I think the greatest liberal of the 19th century as an intellectual is John Stuart Mill, his father James Mill. John Stuart Mill spends his life, until he retires very early, working for the East India Company. His father spent his life working for the East India Company. This was a company that ran India, that taxed Indians to support the British Army in India, that distorted trade in all these sorts of ways. So these things are very entwined. Are they entwined or are they core? One of the interesting things that happens in India is that the writings of John Stuart Mill on liberty, the various preachings of liberals, are actually taken up by Indians themselves. They read these books and they say, actually, you're talking about liberty. Why doesn't that include me? You're talking about limiting power. Why has the East India Company got all this power? Why aren't you limiting? Why don't you apply these rules to yourselves? And then a lot of British people, even people who were ruling India, thought, wait a minute, we're in a bit of a difficult situation here. So the argument that the independence movement uses, and Nehru uses, and the rest of them, are liberal arguments. So I think there is a core of liberalism that can be extracted from these sins of imperialism and slavery and preserved. And I would say also that it's very important to preserve that core, because there are certain people who are trying to use this idea that liberalism and imperialism are intimately connected to reinforce their power. So Modi, if you say to Modi, a strongman ruler of India, well, you shouldn't be doing this because it's against the constitution. You shouldn't be doing this because you're expanding your power illegitimately. So those are all British rules. We inherited those from the British royals. They're not part of the Hindu culture. So I think there are massive sins, and we can talk about the sins of contemporary liberals, absolutely. But I say that not that the idea that the ideas are not pure, but they are good ideas that can be salvaged from their consequences. And when it comes to property rights, again, we can talk about that, but that is an idea which I don't think is an absolute commitment of liberals. It may have been for Locke, but I think they've been modified.
I don't want to stick on this because it's ultimately people are going to have a view on it, and they can read Dominic Lacerdo, they can read your book, and they can make their own minds up. But there's an extraordinary statistic when I was speaking to Ranada Gupta recently, and he characterises 18th century Britain, which is that's the century after the Glorious Revolution. He characterises Britain in the 18th century as, I think he called it, an oligarchic despotism. 250,000 people over a space of around, this is in his book, I mean, it's an extraordinary number, I find it hard to believe, frankly, but there's the citation, etc. 250,000 people are press-ganged into being a part of the British military over about 120 years. In one way or another, so Navy, British Army, I presume there's other parts of the sort of logistical infrastructure that's helping all of that, maybe building things and vessels at home and whatnot. But 250,000 people. So it's quite interesting that at this moment of, the birth of a doctrine which is about individual liberty, we see the Enclosure Acts. We see people being press-ganged into the British Army, the British Navy. We see slavery. And so I do think, and I think the arguments you're making are they're not even persuasive. I think they're just true. I think anybody can say, well, this is my belief system. I think there are some good ideas that we can take from the wreckage and the ruins of history. I think almost anybody can say that about their worldview, and I think that's reasonable. But that's not something we generally hear from liberals. What we hear from liberals instead is, conservatism is crazy because of this bad thing that happened. Social democracy or socialism is crazy because of this bad thing that happened. Collectivized food production. Yeah, that's crazy, right? The Great Leap Forward. That was really dumb. I agree. People melting frying pans to, show, amp up iron production for Mao was crazy. Massacring sparrows was crazy. But so was, press ganging hundreds of thousands of men. So was slavery. So were the Enclosure Acts. And it does seem almost unique to liberals. And I'm not saying laying this at your feet because you're not doing it, but it does seem almost unique to liberals that they're unwilling to accept the historical monstrosities done in the name of their ideology, and yet simultaneously they make the exact same accusations at other people. I
understand that.
And I think it feeds into something you talk about really well in the book, which is the kind of complacency at the heart of modern liberalism.
Yeah. I mean, if you talk people, if you judge people entirely on the basis of their ideals, everybody's wonderful because their ideals are wonderful. And liberals have tended to do that about themselves. And we will come on to this, I'm sure, but it's very important for liberals to own up to their errors in more recent years if they're going to be taken at all seriously as agents of reform in the future. But throughout most of human history, life has been solitary, poor, nasty, Brutus, in short. As Hobbes said, throughout most of human history, we've had slavery. Throughout most of human history, we've had press ganging. What's unusual is not these horrors. What's unusual is attempts to correct these horrors.
Montesquieu doesn't say that. Montesquieu says, in Europe, we saw the demise of slavery, and now with the rise of private property regimes, which is basically what he's saying, Dutch Republic, Britain, American Republic, we're seeing the return of slavery. That's the thing.
Yeah, I mean, we did have serfdom as opposed to slavery, but yes, slavery is not as prevalent as it was, let's say, in the Roman Empire. And slavery does actually, if you take 19th century America, by the time of the American Revolution, and not that long after the American Revolution, you are seeing slavery sort of dying a natural death. And you're seeing George Washington freeing his slaves, not just out of altruism, but because it doesn't make that much economic sense compared with free labor. And what you have, I think, at the beginning of the 19th century is the invention of the cotton gin, which massively increases the efficiency of slavery. So slavery once again becomes an economically exceptionally profitable way of doing things. So instead of it becomes just a more efficient way of doing things than free labor. So you get something that is declining, massively increasing, and also spreading right, from the core South right across Texas and to new states and things like that. So when Lincoln does battle against slavery, he is doing battle against an economic system that is expanding, that is revitalized, and he does it in the name of of idealism, I think, definitely in the name of idealism. But this is not killing a system that's dying. It's killing a system, but for mechanistic reason, for the reason of the cotton gin, for the process of cleaning, of removing the seeds from the cotton, is on the ascendancy. So global cotton prices are going down. It's an efficient system that they're against. So, and the people defend it in the name of property. Lincoln says property is less important than human lives and things like that. But this is a battle over how the republic should be governed, in which the economic arguments are not entirely clear.
I'm sorry to interrupt this conversation. I hope you're enjoying it, by the way. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I'm enjoying having it. I love Downstream. Obviously, Novara as an organisation is like a child to me, like a baby. But Downstream is like my grandchild, my granddaughter. It's the baby of the baby. I really enjoy the conversations. I really enjoy meeting our audience out there, actually. They say all kinds of nice things generally about what we're doing with Downstream. I think it's a really important space to have really important conversations. That doesn't mean it's perfect. And it doesn't mean Novara Media is perfect. We want to grow, we have a mission, but we want to go in a direction which actually meets the needs of you guys, which is why we want to hear from you. Our ambition at Novara has always been to be people-powered. That's going to require you letting us know what you think, and not just in the comments. The Novara audience survey is now live. It's a chance for you to give us feedback, the good, the bad, dare I say, even the ugly. We want to know. We are planning to have a massive 2026 and, of course, a massive few years before the next general election. But we want that input from you to really pack a punch. As a little incentive, if you submit your thoughts by the end of Sunday, the 12th of April, you stand a chance to win one of 5 £50 vouchers to spend in the Novara merch shop. Spend it on books, spend it on a T-shirt, spend it on whatever you like. Just hit the link in the description below or head to novara.media/survey now. Let's move to more contemporary conversations.
Yeah.
As interesting as this stuff is, it's not actually the meat of the book. And I have to say, people will see the title Centrists, the World Unite, the Lost Genius of Liberalism, and they'll think this guy's just an apologist for everything that's gone wrong in the last 40 years. Anything but. You wrote a great column for Unheard. You specifically talk about, before people buy the book, which I do recommend, just read that column. You talk specifically about double liberalism, which is really pertains to the mistakes of the liberal world order in the West over the last 40, 50 years. Just explain, or maybe even longer actually in the case of one of those liberalisms, just explain what double liberalism means for you.
Yeah, what liberalism is a doctrine that has changed over time. And liberalism is a solution to problems rather than the rigid things. So as I said earlier, you could have small government liberalism, you could have big government liberalism, you can have different manifestations of this philosophy. But what happened in the 1980s and 1990s was that liberalism becomes identified with two things. One is economic liberalism. You shrink the role of the state. You change the role of the state to be as light touch as possible, and you expand the notion of the market. You call that neoconservatism if you want. A neoliberalism if you want, or neoconservatism. The same thing really there. The second use of the term liberal is social liberalism, which means essentially that you shouldn't be judgmental about people's choices. So that would be being sympathetic or being open to gay rights, gay marriage, but also sympathetic to people, whatever form of life they want to adopt, they adopt that. So economic liberalism and social liberalism arise at roughly the same time. Mrs. Thatcher pushes through economic liberalism. Tony Blair comes along, and Bill Clinton comes along, and preserves that neoliberal model, but adds to it social liberalism, they would call it tolerance. And both these things are united by the notion that the individual is the best judge of their interests, of their values, of their life. So the collective must retreat. Individualism is ascendant. And I think in many ways, this was a positive, or it was something that could be quite easily defended. You had in the 1970s a sclerotic, stagflation sort of world, and you got a certain liberation from that under Thatcherism. You also had a world in which homosexuals were being persecuted or prosecuted, or minorities were being treated very badly. And under the more socially tolerant view, again, a liberation. A phrase for this, a very popular phrase for this, is bourgeois Bohemianism. It's a marriage of bourgeois values with Bohemian values, creating the BoBo world. And that has been the template of liberalism ever since. And many of the people who believe it wouldn't articulate it in this sense, but this is what guides a lot of public policy. And you can see, legalizing gambling or legalizing drug use or being generous to business, positive, aspirational about business, all part of the same sort of thing. And it does seem to be extremely sensible, and also being very liberal about immigration, I think, would be part of that, because A, that's socially tolerant, but also it's economically useful to business to have lots of labour. That almost became so banal over the last 20 or 30 years that nobody really, you'd have to be sort of slightly mad to question it. It was an unquestioning orthodoxy. And now what we've been seeing is the negative side of these things being very manifest. So manifest that you can't ignore the problems that have been created. But what you have is a liberal elite, which has personally done extremely well out of all of these things, denying the downsides, or justifying or dismissing the downsides, or simply continuing to repeat the same phrases without acknowledging the downsides. And I think that's one of the reasons why we get in the current polarization, that people on the left and people on the right think that the liberals are just mouthing platitudes, not addressing the problems that exist, or just ignoring them. And that's the development of the downside of the BoBo world.
Yeah, I think it's a really good formulation. And it was surprising to me when I see you citing people like Patrick Deneen.
Yeah.
Who writes this really, I think it's a good, I don't agree with Patrick Deneen very much.
It's a good book.
But it's a very good book, very challenging book about contemporary liberalism, 2017, 2018?
That's correct, yeah.
And so it was interesting for me to see a guy, and you were at The Economist for over 30 years, you now are at Bloomberg. I thought, crikey, okay, that's fascinating that somebody in that world is engaging with Deneen's critiques of liberalism, actually taking some of it on board. And I do think it captures a lot. And, in that column for Unheard, you talk about how, that post-liberal critique has a lot to it. Doesn't mean you're a post-liberal just because you think there's some validity there. And I would certainly agree with that conclusion. So for BoBo, just to condense that for our audience, that basically is, privatizing water's fine, but I'm also in favor of gay marriage. The sort of the apotheosis of this was David Cameron, right? Sure. In many ways, bringing these two sort of traditions together. How unpopular is that as a politics? And do you think that the political and media class, who broadly have brought into that as a worldview, do they understand how unpopular it is?
I would say it's extremely unpopular. And what is even more unpopular than the synthesis is people's unwillingness to confront the fact that there's a downside. And I think the media class is absolutely guilty of this. And I must say, in my journalistic career, but the easiest way, if you were a relatively right-wing person and you said, yes, I believe in privatizing water or markets, you'll say, but I also believe in legalizing drugs. Everyone said, well, he's not that bad. He's bad, but he's not that bad. It became a sort of way of cleansing yourself with that argument. I think both the water and the drugs arguments are probably wrong. So I think it's become a sort of mantra, and it's become a very dangerous mantra, partly because I think that the negative consequences of a lot of these things have become too big to ignore, and partly because simply insisting on doing the same thing as before, repeating the same thing as before, has alienated people. And it's also paralyzed the centre, because if you insist on ignoring problems and just repeating phrases, or just repeating an old formula, it's like the late Soviet Union. People know that you don't really believe it, And let me give you two sort of examples of why I began. I wrote this book, for two reasons. One, because I was genuinely worried. Am genuinely worried about what is happening to the liberal order and what is happening to the world, and the collapse of the liberal order, the advance of the axis of autocracy, what's happening to the United States with Trump and everything was worried me. And every year that passed as I was writing this book, things got worse. And then when I published it, we had the Iran war, so things got worse, even worse. So I wrote it partly because of worry, but also I wrote it out of a sense of guilt, because I was a bourgeois Bohemian. I mean, I would have believed almost all of these things and preached these sort of things.
Until when? What was the moment?
Well, I'm going to say there are two moments when I really begin to, I discarded these beliefs and began to realise that the negative side was something that we couldn't ignore. One was I was writing a piece for The Economist on the Scandinavian world, and I was in Malmo. And looking at the extraordinary achievements of this very Pacific society, this very well-organised society, which is Sweden. And then I went out to look at a housing estate. I think it's called Rosengård. I think even Wallander lived there when he was doing his early police training. But anyway, there's Rosengård. And there you have a group of immigrants who are completely cut off from Swedish society. They're living in these housing estates, which are on the periphery of Malmo. They're not working. They're not culturally assimilating. They're just put there in storage. And I thought, this is not good, because then, they're just outside society. It's a parallel world. And there's a lot of crime. And as we know, Sweden, I think now, or until recently, had the highest rate of deaths by shooting in Europe, which for a society which prided itself on being Pacific. So you have a real immigration crisis there. And I went to after seeing this, I went to talk to the Minister of Immigration, and I was saying to her, there's obviously a problem here. And she just looked at me as though I was crazy and said, "You've been talking to, racists." I said, "But I've seen it. I've just been there. Somebody took me around." And I looked at her. She refused to believe anything. Subsequent to that, Sweden has had this massive internal debate and things have changed. So that made me think, wait a minute, there's a set of beliefs which sound very nice and tolerant, but actually there's a reality which is very different from that. The second sort of moment when I thought that my beliefs were wrong was when I went to San Francisco. I was at the University of California at Berkeley in 1984 to 1985. A long time ago, during the Reagan presidency. And I would often go to San Francisco, and I thought it was like the closest you could get to paradise on earth. It was a beautiful place, a beautiful city, but it was also, there was a significant working class presence. It was quite a working class town, actually, San Francisco, until then. There was the hippie element, there was the gay element, it was just a really good, fun place to be. Great bars, it was marvelous. I thought, this is heaven, I'd love to live here. I didn't live there. I moved back and lived elsewhere. And then I went back there in, I can't remember, 2014, 15, and it was the exact opposite of heaven on earth. There were thousands, more than 1,000 homeless people living in the streets, living in tents, encampments. There were people shooting up heroin or whatever they're doing. There's the opioid thing. There's people smoking crack. There's people shitting in the streets. There's just, the whole of downtown is devastation. Mm. And then there are interest groups that say anybody who tries to address these problems, to clean up the homelessness, is infringing on people's rights. And, that this is a sort of like slavery. You're stopping people from doing what they want to do. You are making judgments on them for choosing this lifestyle. So you have open-air drug markets, and they're allowed to flourish, and the mayor allows them to flourish because that is infringing on people's freedom. And then it strikes me that if you have this double liberalism, markets must prevail, and people's choice of their lifestyle must prevail, and it leads to this. That's not a way of running a country, a republic. And at the same time, of course, because you have the massive tech boom, you've got people, picking their way through the debris of human life to taste the most delicious sushi that is currently fashionable amongst the tech world. I thought that, this is not a survivable world.
Yeah.
And one of the ways in which it's manifested itself, I mean, the radicalization of the tech people is partly in response to the collapse of the public sphere. And it struck me that we have to make some sort of distinction between good choices and bad choices. We have to realize that addiction is a real problem, that people can do things against their own interests. And then we have to do something about the tech industry, which I hope we'll talk about a bit later. So these two double liberalisms struck me as being unsustainable because they don't make distinctions about preferences, because they don't have any notion of the public good or the public sphere, and because ultimately they depend on an impoverished notion of the human agent, which is the human agent is just a pleasure, profit maximizing entity, which is in utilitarianism. So when I say I want to defend liberalism, I'm trying to defend a particular form of liberalism to some extent against, Benthamite utilitarianism, I would say ultimately leads to this sort of worldview.
Who's the Chinese ideologue you mentioned in the book?
Wan Haning. He's the sort of the most admired public intellectual in China. He has enormous influence with the Communist Party and with Xi. And basically, he did the sort of Tocqueville-like tour of the United States, went round and looked at the United States and saw all the people living in the streets and the people zooming past in their limousines, and said that this culture, this civilization, cannot be sustained. It's dying of decadence. And what he says is, something that's also, if you read people like Patrick Deneen, that's the critique that they will make. That if you look at the streets of San Francisco, if you look at the more extreme manifestations of liberalism, those things are not just accidental. Those things are essential to liberalism. That the more liberalism becomes itself, in Deneen's phrase, the more it will produce those things. It will produce an aristocracy of talent that has no connections with the rest of society, poor people living in the street, shooting up heroin and taking barbiturates or whatever it is, and a society that doesn't cohere. That is liberalism's inevitable end. That's what we have in the future. It's a very powerful argument. It's not entirely wrong.
Yeah. Somebody who's on the left, I'm a socialist, I believe in a public realm. I find it really frustrating that you see people on the left basically making, I think, arguments which aren't from the left, which is effectively ultra-liberalism. And I'm saying, well, we believe in a public realm. We believe in social solidarity. We believe in a form of wider community. You can call that a nation, locality, class, but we don't think we're all, completely detached and atomized from one another. We have obligations to one another as well as rights. There's a very strong, coherent centre-left or left-wing argument to make all these conclusions. And it's interesting, and this isn't a criticism or a pop at you, because I agree with everything you're saying, but it's interesting that somebody from, the Economist and at Bloomberg, not that you agree with these people, not that I agree with these people, but you can see the validity in arguments being made by Wang Haning or maybe even Alexander Dugin or God knows who
I wouldn't go that far.
No, but of course, no. But there's a parody of liberalism they criticise, and that isn't the reality, but there's a kernel of truth to it.
Absolutely.
Obviously a more sophisticated person doing that is Patrick Deneen.
The kernel of truth there is that if you have a pure Benthamism, and if you regard the individual as just a pleasure-seeking, profit-maximizing individual with no connections to society, then you can quite easily end up there. I mean, Bentham would probably say that people, by seeking their pleasure and avoiding pain, will produce a better world. But I don't think he factors into things like addiction and bad choices in the way that you ought to. But let me talk about The Economist and Bloomberg. It strikes me that if liberalism is to survive in a world in which all the intellectual and emotional and political energy is shifting very rapidly to the right and to the left, and liberalism is becoming this shrunken middle, it cannot survive just by repeating the same formula. It cannot survive just by saying we never made a mistake. It has to own its mistakes, and it has to develop liberal solutions to these problems. If you don't develop liberal solutions to these problems, if you just say these problems don't exist, then you will die as a political creed. In my book, I argue that liberalism has repeatedly faced death. It's repeatedly gone through near-death experiences in the 1890s, which we talked about earlier, in the 1930s, to some extent in the 1970s, and it has always succeeded in regenerating itself. But it's because it's regenerated itself by saying we've been doing some things wrong. We need to adjust what we're doing to deal with new problems, and we can't just keep repeating ourselves. And if you want to see the death of liberalism, you look at Joe Biden's last election. It was a communist sort of affair. It was basically a very old man who didn't know what they were doing, literally didn't know what they were doing. Every now and again, if they could begin to remember, repeating a few phrases, and then Kamala Harris, who again couldn't articulate a case. And this was like the late Soviet regime, really. And I would say that that the rebirth has to come with acknowledging problems, but the rebirth also has to come with acknowledging that people on the right and people on the left, in articulating a certain anger about certain problems, might well be right, not in the solutions that they are articulating, but in identifying those problems. And I would say one of these things that you're going to agree with me about, and the other one you won't agree with me about, I suspect, is we have two huge problems which liberals are failing massively to confront or deal with. One is the power and nature of the tech industry, and the second is the failure of immigration to be properly managed and immigrants to be assimilated within a common culture.
I don't disagree on the second one. On the common culture thing, again, it's about the left believing in a public realm. Yeah. I think that is a live debate, and I think that lots of people are probably, in my view, are on the wrong end of it. But I think that's the conversation you need to have. I suppose where I get frustrated, particularly with the right, is they say, we want net zero migration. We have a median age of 41. We have a fertility rate heading to 1, I think, by the end of the next decade. And, it's all 23-year-old guys who don't, and why would they have kids at that age? But they don't have kids. They're not looking to have kids. I feel like you can talk about less migration if you've got a family of 3, But if you're not willing to do the hard work of actually having people, then fundamentally we are not going to have pensions and a healthcare system and anything resembling a functioning society, let alone economy, without a measure of immigration. Now, the question is, how much is in the public interest? Clearly, 1 million people, like you see in 2022 or whatever it was, net, is crazy. I think that's crazy. If you're a society that's building 100,000 homes a year and you're having net migration of 1 million, I mean, that's just mathematics. It's not going to work. I don't think that's even I don't see why that's left or centre or right. It's just obviously a dysfunctional outcome. Yeah. I think as well on that recognition, this is really important. So for me, I've never been to California. I've been to Vancouver, and something similar happened. Yeah, something really similar happened. It was after COVID, and I was walking down one part of Vancouver where I think maybe I saw 1,500, 2,000 people just doing drugs out in the street. And the crazy thing with Vancouver is, like in bits of California, it's right next to extraordinary wealth, right? And so you see these gleaming towers, you see people walking into their, expensive third-generation coffee shops, walking over their fellow man.
That's right.
Dying in front of them. Yeah. And if you say that as somebody on the left, they'd say, well, why are you looking down on these poor people with addiction problems? I'm not. You're looking down on them by thinking that this is a permissible way to live. It's an undignified, awful way to live. We should be doing something about it. And that was definitely a moment of recognition for me. But rather than going on a rant, I say that because, you're in the journalism game, so you're talking to lots of people, you're going to lots of places. How common do you think that realization is amongst your age cohort, within your profession of, actually, the BoBo thing kind of hasn't turned out like we expected? Is that a common experience, do you think, or is it something that you think is ahead of us? It's going to happen in the next couple of years?
I found with talking and publicizing this book, I found a lot of people who I thought would be unwilling to listen, being more willing to listen than I expected. I think to some extent the journalistic profession lives in a BoBo world, definitely. Those are their values, and they don't like to be thought of as intolerant, and they don't like to be thought of as backward-looking when it comes to the economy. But then if they're my generation, they look at how difficult it is for their children to get jobs. And if they're the younger generation, they see some of the we all see the problems on the streets, but they live more amongst it. That there is a growing recognition of that. And I just go back to the San Francisco question, that in San Francisco, a lot of organized interest groups on behalf of the homelessness, of the homeless, NGO-funded groups, would fight attempts by the city, or definitely the police, to police drug markets or big homeless encampments. They say because these people have a right, they should be left to do these things. They're free, they're human beings. They should, if that's how they choose to live, that's great.
So that was the ideological argument they'd make.
They would make that ideological arguments. A lot of them funded by NGOs, strangely enough, some of them by sort of Trustafarian people like that. So there was a big chunk of the left that defended this, significant chunk of the left, and you had a mayor who was basically in that camp for a significant period of time with the strange name of London Breed. That was her name.
Sounds like an ale or something, doesn't it?
I know. So it was the sort of consensus. But the situation became so bad that, not being wishing to sound rude, but even progressives said, we can't keep this up. And they now have a new mayor called Daniel Laurie, who is improving the situation and increasing the number of homeless people who are put in homeless shelters and breaking up the drug markets and things like that. And the reason I keep focusing on this is because of the notion of the individual. I focus on it because I think it's a horrible, terrible thing, and it was really shocking to see it. But the notion of the individual. The liberalism as a creed is a creed which puts the individual at the very centre of what they're doing, and says that society starts with the individual and works upwards. That's our core belief. But then you have to ask the question, what is the individual? What constitutes the individual? And since the 1980s, we've had a view of the individual as essentially being a profit or pleasure maximizing unit, which should be allowed to do as much as it wants unless they're really impinging upon the lives of other people, and we shouldn't judge them. Judgmentalism is bad. Interfering in business is bad. And I think that is an impoverished view of the individual in general. I also think it's a misunderstanding of what the 19th century view of the liberals post Jeremy Bentham is. Because if you look at serious 19th century liberals like John Stuart Mill, like Matthew Arnold, they're constantly making a distinction between our better selves and our lower selves, our higher selves and our lower selves, between a good choice and a bad choice, between something that is beautiful and something that's ugly. So they're trying to say that the individual can be a self-improving, self-regulating entity. It can choose good things and it can choose bad things. And John Stuart Mill breaks with Jeremy Bentham on precisely this point. So I would say, from the 1980s onwards, we've had this Benthamite view of the individual, which doesn't make room for the quality of our preferences. And the quality of our preferences must include aesthetic things. It must include moral things, but it must also include social things, including social responsibility. So what happens with John Stuart Mill? When John Stuart Mill he grows up in this extraordinary environment where his father trains him to be the perfect utilitarian. And he's learning Greek at the age of 3 and Latin at the age of 4, and he writes a history of India when he's 8 because his father is writing a history of India, and in fact neither him nor his father actually go to India, despite the fact they're writing these great books. And Mill ultimately has a sort of mental breakdown because of this appallingly arid childhood. And after this mental breakdown, he begins to do a number of things. He begins to read poetry, particularly the late poets, particularly Coleridge. And he begins to perceive that there's a beauty in language which can't be just dismissed as a pleasure-maximizing thing. It has an aesthetic virtue of its own. He falls in love with a woman who eventually, after a long period of time, because she's married to somebody else, he marries. So he understands that life has emotions to it. And he begins to look at the real choices that people face, poor versus rich, and begins to discover that those choices are constrained for poor people in the way that they're not constraints for rich people. So before that, he said, we can't have cooperation between trade unionists because that's interference in free trade. And then he begins to think, wait a minute, these people, the only thing that they can do is join trade unions to sort of level out the playing field. And so what he does at that point is move to the right in certain ways, in the sense that he begins to value cultural traditions, particularly Coleridge, much more valuably. He says that there is this great cultural tradition that we must preserve. But he also moves to the left in other ways, particularly about the problems of inequality, women not having the vote and things like that. And that is his sort of reaction to the poverty of utilitarianism. And my argument in this book is that we're at that sort of historical stage, that we've gone through this long period of utilitarianism with neoliberalism and left-wing liberalism, and we need to move both to the right and the left. To the right in the sense that we need to put much more value on cultural tradition in giving us a home in history, but also that we need to be much more aggressive in antitrust and in defense of our own interests collectively against the power of the tech companies.
So are you a Xi-pilled liberal? Because the things you're saying about actually individual freedom, I know this is not what the Chinese state says, but there's some sort of ideological crossover. There's a line from Hegel, what is it about? Freedom is basically fulfilling your obligation, fulfilling your duty. That percolates through lots of 20th and 21st century socialist states. You see it obviously there with Islam.
Yeah.
And these challenges to liberal modernity about actually individual flourishing, whether or not the societies that deploy these ideologies, whether or not they live up to it is a separate matter. But this idea that in order for individuals to be free, there need to be some external constraints and there has to be a development of internal restraints. You're basically saying the same thing.
No, not really. But an interesting text here is Isaiah Berlin's essay on liberty, in which he says that there are two forms of liberty. There is freedom from people telling you what to do, and there is freedom to realize your historical role. And he says, well, obviously the second form of liberty is terrible. The freedom to fulfill your obligations is no form of freedom. And that's been used by totalitarians to control people. And the only form of freedom that really matters is freedom from external orders. I think that there is a middle way. And he is criticizing, in this essay, he's particularly criticizing T.H. Green, who is one of the founders of the new liberalism, influenced by Hegel very much. But what T.H. Green is saying in that is that the freedom of the individual must involve the freedom that comes from being educated, that comes from making rational choices, that comes from pursuing higher ends in life. And T.H. Green is a sort of typical nonconformist, late 19th century, early 20th century liberal who believes in teetotalism and things like that, and who believes in education, rather crusading sort of figure. But I think that sort of middle way liberalism, not just freedom from, and certainly, not the Hegelian realizing your role in history, but that says there are good cells and bad cells, there are good choices and bad choices, and we must, in some sense, have a society that recognizes those distinctions and is not just about getting. I think we've lost that middle meaning of freedom, liberals have, and that's a terrible thing because it means the world is divided increasingly between, on the one hand, doing what history or society or Xi tells you to do, on the one hand, and on the other hand, just the market view of freedom.
Yeah, Xi and history being the same thing. But I do think, look, I mean, obviously you're making a developed case and intellectually it's very coherent, but to zoom back, like for somebody who's a liberal, who has had the career you've had, to be saying things like, actually, we shouldn't be legalizing drugs, actually, we should have really big constraints on social media, etc. I think if you were saying that like 10, 15 years ago, I'm sure many of your colleagues would have said, hold on a second, we're not China. That's just the reality of it, isn't it?
No, I think they'd be very shocked by that. They probably are very shocked by what I'm saying now. But let me give you the example of tech, the tech movement, which is developing the most powerful companies in the world. I think the essence of liberalism is individualism. And what we mean by individualism is educated individuals making sensible choices in some sense in their long-term interests. And what the tech industry is doing at an extraordinary speed is deconstructing the individual. They are fragmenting our attention spans. They're shortening our attention spans. They're filling the news media with deliberate lies. They're pumping. They're leading. They're going all the way down our brain cells, brain stems to our lowest emotions. They are turning us into something less than individuals, almost like sort of functions of the machine. And you can see all sorts of figures that are extremely worrying. There's something called the Flynn effect, whereby global IQ has gone up relentlessly from 1900 to 2000. IQ levels just kept going up. In the year 2000, they start going down. PISA scores for numeracy, PISA scores for literacy start going down. Roughly the time when these phones become pervasive. So our capacity to think in the long term, our capacity to have individual self-control, our capacity to function as a coherent agent of our own lives is being reduced. Now, the liberal world was created with the rise of individualism in the 17th and 18th century, and it may well be the case that individuals are being deconstructed as we speak. We may be moving to a post-liberal world because of the nature of the technology that these people have created. And if you look at tech valuations only make any sense whatsoever if these things are going to become much more powerful and pervasive, and the industry is going to become much more concentrated. So I would say that the liberal order faces two massive threats at the moment. One is the axis of autocracy, China, Russia, which are pressing not only to change the liberal order, but to roll over our countries. The secondly is the tech industry. And I would say of the two, the tech industry is the bigger threat.
Wow. I didn't expect you to say that.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, on the Musk point, he's presently worth, I know it changes every day. I think he's worth about $800 billion, this week. Obviously, he has that pay package. If certain things happen with Tesla, he's easily going to become a trillionaire. And I think this is a really important point to make. That is a signal. That's a market signal saying that you're going to invent reality.
Yep.
When people are giving you $1 trillion pay deal, if Tesla valuation hits X, Y, Z, and people say, well, it won't. It'll actually be less, and he'll get less. But the idea of a trillionaire, I think that's a really concerning sign about where we're headed. I want to talk about some concrete policies, because some people will be watching and they'll be thinking, yeah, the guy's a liberal. Yeah, totally get it, just like me. Some people will be saying, he's a bit of a social democrat with conservative characteristics. So, these are all obviously fluid terms. I think there's probably a bit of truth to all of that. But you talk about, for instance, on policy, because this is where, this stuff is instantiated in the real world. You oppose, for instance, things like VAT on private schools. So you talk about, rising inequality. We've got to pay to reinvigorate and revive the public realm. That money is going to have to come from somewhere. Now, I know private school VAT doesn't raise very much money. So if you weren't putting VAT on private schools, for instance, where are we going to get money from? Or where are we going to spend less money? Or is it not a case of that, actually?
I think that the broad left has become very focused on redistribution. For understandable reasons. But I would say there are two problems with redistribution. One is that a great deal of inequality is rooted not in the tax system in a way that can be avoided. A great deal of inequality is just people who are successful and rich marrying other people who are successful and rich. And that creates a couple who are not only earning a significant amount of money, but provide their children with better opportunities. So it's very hard to deal with inequality rooted.
Hasn't always been the case, though?
No, because of the massive entry of women into the workforce in recent years. So I think redistribution as an end is very often frustrated by those realities. But more important, I would say we have to make priorities here, and I would say that the biggest priority we should have in terms of economics is to deal with the power and nature of the tech industry. That we should have a much more focused end. Let's not create an equal society, which is going to take a long time and might well be frustrated. Let's take obvious evils and prevent them from existing. And there are two things that I think we can do on the tech industry. One is change the emphasis of antitrust legislation. Antitrust legislation, up until now, because of the influence of Robert Bork primarily, has basically said that the consolidation of companies doesn't really matter that much if prices are going down, and so you're generating consumer benefits. And that has been the case with the tech industry because it's a price-reducing industry, basically. And you are generating consumer benefits. You can get all sorts of wonderful things on your phone. But I think there are two things we should be worried about there. One is that consumer benefit is not the only metric. Power should be a metric. As Lord Acton said, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's just as true in the private sector as it is in the public sector. And Louis Brandeis, who was the great antitrust lawyer who preceded Robert Bork, said that actually we must take into account all of these considerations of power and of opportunity and of the nature and the health of democracy. That's been completely ruled out of antitrust thinking for the last 40 years in this period of liberal hegemony. I think we need to go back to the Bork, to the Brandeis way of thinking. Take concentration of power very, very seriously. Secondly, there's all of the consumer benefits that we're calculating are not measured against harms to the consumer because we don't think about harms. So I think these devices are addictive. They're deliberately addictive. They quite often spread misinformation deliberately. Musk being somebody who's quite often in that business. But we had a piece of legislation which, I say we, I mean the United States, which was passed in 1996, and it was called Article 230 of the Telecommunications Act. And that article basically said that the carriers and the internet companies are not responsible for any harms generated by what they're producing. If we could repeal that and replace and make them legally responsible for harms, they would be destroyed by law cases, and they would react to the threat of law cases by regulating what they did because they could easily do it, but they don't have any incentive to do it. So I would say that overturning Article 230 and changing the nature of thinking about antitrust would be where I would focus my efforts rather than on bigger schemes for redistribution.
I mean, I would, just to be clear, I would have VAT on private schools because it's a consumer good that people are buying. I mean, I probably would have phased it in 5% every year over 5 years or whatever, or 4 years to get it to 20%. But whatever, I can see that argument. I think there's probably something to that, which is, people like Rachel Reeves, people like Bridget Phillipson are focusing on what is ultimately a tiny thing. It might not even be a net revenue generator. I mean, if it is, it's going to be hundreds of millions. I think it probably will be that. It's not going to be the sum they initially said it was going to be, in excess of $1 billion to the Exchequer. And I do buy the argument that you're focusing on this quite minute thing while you're leaving alone, the fact that the security services in this country, MI5, MI6, depend on AWS for their digital reproduction. You are not a sovereign country when you're depending on an American company for your web service with your security services. Equally, Amazon, it's destroyed the high street. We need a proper conversation about reviving high streets. I don't think, talking about VAT, we should apply VAT on books sold on Amazon. That is not a left-wing thing. It's not a right-wing thing. I think it's a very common sense thing to do. It'll raise money and it'll incentivize people to buy books at a bookshop. Great. I think that'd be a really good thing to do. But it does feel, and those sound like easy wins, right?
No.
And yet, okay, so no, why not?
well, repealing Article 230, that would be something that would fundamentally challenge the profit model of the big tech companies, and it would take a massive battle to change that. But it's not an impossible battle to fight because there are people on the right of the Republican Party who are very worried about the power and the nature of the tech companies, partly because they regard them as too left-wing, but partly because of pornography and all of that sort of stuff, moral degradation. And there are a lot of people on the left of the Democratic Party who worry about these things. But let me produce another series of things which I think are sort of might once have belonged to the left, but I think that a regalvanized centre should be looking at, all based on moral exaltation and judgmentalism. One is the power of the food companies. They put all of the sort of unhealthy stuff that they put in food. I think that's something that we collectively should be much more concerned about. We should be concerned about regulating it, because what's happening to obesity and ill health and life expectancies, stagnating, is something which is a public concern. And we did actually manage to stop people from smoking. Not all of them, but very large numbers of them. We could apply the same way of thinking. I think that's also true of drugs. I think another example would be gambling. Gambling is a massive problem in this country. I just read, I think in the Financial Times the other day, that the amount of money being spent on sports gambling in the United States has gone from 13 billion in 2019 to 167 billion this year. It's a massive epidemic, destroys families, destroys lives. That's, again, Tony Blair, quite a moralizing figure in some ways, but his government legalized gambling, not legalized gambling. I mean, they made legalized sort of high street gambling. All of these slot machine shops, deregulated.
They didn't get the super casino at Blackpool.
No, but they did a lot, because that was the BoBo thing. Let people determine their own lives. Again, not taking into account addiction, our ability to make decisions which in the long term are against our interests. So I would say that, again, have these targeted attacks on obvious evils much more than a preoccupation with redistribution. Not that I'm not going to say it's a secondary issue, but it wouldn't be the things that I would put right at the top of my agenda.
I suppose, and this is me interviewing you, so my point of view is kind of irrelevant, but I do kind of think that with an aging society, with a deficit in terms of infrastructure spending going back 40, 50 years, we probably are going to have to have higher taxes. But anyway, we can park that. Finally, drugs, because you said that we've dealt very well with tobacco. Of course, tobacco is legal, and we've stopped loads of people smoking. I suppose one argument is that, well, if we legalise cannabis, there is a world where we can have fewer people smoking cannabis, because I'll be honest, where I live, I smell more marijuana than I do cigarette smoke.
Sure.
So as a liberal, why are you not in favour of decriminalising drugs?
As a liberal, I was once very much in favour of decriminalising drugs, and I think that was, that was absolutely central to the creed. And it was central to the creed partly because we believe people should make choices of their own. And as I said earlier, it was a way of decontaminating yourselves. I'm a Thatcherite, but I believe anybody could smoke drugs, and that's great. So everybody thought, you're not too bad. Because I think that addiction is a real thing, that addiction can change the way that you make preferences in such a way that you're making preferences that harm you. Because I think that common street drugs like marijuana are much stronger and much more powerful and much more, quite often, produce long-term harms like schizophrenia in a way that we didn't think that they did. I think they're stronger drugs now than they were when I was in my 20s. And because I think that the case for freedom is not an all-powerful one. As I say, I think there are good choices and bad choices. There are good selves and lower selves. And I think we ought to nudge people, horrible word, I know, but I think we ought to nudge people into making better decisions. The model, I would actually be much harder on hard drugs than we are. Wherever I go in London, people are smoking. You can smell marijuana all over the place. And I do think that we should apply to marijuana. I wouldn't, whether you legalise it or not, I don't know. But you should apply to marijuana the same sort of social disapproval as that we have successfully applied to nicotine, to cigarette smoking, because the amount of cigarette smoking has gone down a lot through the price mechanism, through social disapproval, and through just a general lack of fashionability of these things.
But I suppose you could make marijuana more... I mean, for instance, one of the very few deflationary goods in Britain over the last 15 years is cocaine, which people find very funny.
I don't know anything about that.
Well, but you have this very funny argument made by libertarians. They say, if you look at the price curve of rent in London or energy or whatever, and then you see cocaine since 2008, it's gone slightly down, and they say, well, look, this is what happens when you don't have the state intervening. And so I suppose if you did have some form of state intervention with the market of cannabis, you might make it more expensive and fewer people be buying it.
I mean, that's a very common argument. One of the peculiar things that's happened in New York is that you have done exactly that.
Yeah.
You have lots and lots of shops that sell marijuana, sometimes under the phrase legal marijuana, medical marijuana, which is nonsense. But you have a market there. And in fact, those things sell marijuana, but also so do the people in the streets. So you just have the overall supply going up because the quality of the marijuana being sold in the shops isn't as high. And because the street, it's almost as though you have pubs, but you also have lots of people with stills in the street selling you whiskey. So you've actually increased the quantity. And I must say it's very hard to walk down the streets in New York without getting a bit stoned.
You know, I remember having this conversation with Peter Hitchens. He said something he's a very funny man. You know, he was adamant that, you know, cocaine should be legalized before marijuana, as in marijuana, because it's just so much more widespread and because the hidden evils of marijuana are so much harder to detect, long-term schizophrenia, etc.
Yeah.
Whereas somebody doing cocaine once every 3 months or something, which is generally how it's consumed rather than, you know, daily use. He said, actually, this is a very dangerous thing. And I have this image in my mind of people doing, you know, cocaine on their commute to work on the London Underground, and Peter Hitchens saying, well, it's better than cannabis. But I think there's certainly some truth to it. And I don't think it should be done lightly. I just think we're at a point as a society where so many people are smoking the stuff. Clearly, we're going to need a different kind of approach. I don't know how you do it. Maybe it means loads of investment in horrible advertising like we did with cigarette smoking, you know, over the last 20, 30 years. But clearly the approach we have right now isn't successful. Let's leave it there. I have really enjoyed this conversation.
So have I. Thank you very much.
I really enjoyed the book. Adrian, great to talk to you.
Thank you. Very enjoyable.